Okay. Thank you, Bruce. I'm delighted to be here at Duke to deliver one of the Hayek lectures. Thank you, Bruce, for inviting me. Time's a little short tonight to present the whole book. So what I hope to do is introduce you to the historical setting, set out a few important themes, acquaint you of some of the leading characters in the story, and with their ideas, which are good, bad, and ugly. My epigraph for today is: history is the present's dialogue with the past about the future. That's epigraph, not epitaph. So what is the book about? Illiberal Reformers tells a story, and it's a story that historians, we aspire to make our stories true, and we work very hard that they be true. It's about the progressive scholars, activists, and politicians who led a progressive era crusade to dismantle laissez-faire, and in so doing remade American economic life with a newly created instrument of reform, which is to say the administrative state. And for those of you who are not historians of economics or not historians of the progressive era, many of their names will be unfamiliar to you. Some will be familiar. The relevant point is that they changed everything. They permanently altered the course of America's economy and its public life. In fact, I'm simply going to assert this as a premise, and I hope you will agree that it's a valid premise by the end of my talk. I'm going to assert that the progressives made the world that we, and by we I mean the people in this room especially, that we live in. And I hope you'll agree that that's the case, not just metaphorically. So it's important to understand the origins of progressivism in all its aspects. I would assert even more boldly maybe that we cannot, that is we Americans cannot understand ourselves and America's place in the world if we don't understand progressivism and its authors. So what's the setting? The setting is, roughly speaking, the 40 years that bracket the turn of the 20th century, the turbulent times of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Historians call this the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. This is the moment, historians use the word moment to describe 4 decades, when the United States becomes a modern, urban, industrial, multicultural world power, and its rise is powered by this spectacular economic growth that we sometimes call the Industrial Revolution. This is a real revolution. This is a revolution that transforms the United States, reaches into its remotest corners. And we can think about the progressives as responding to that tsunami of economic, political, and social change. Now, the vital national issues of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution are economic issues: economic depression, financial panic, labor conflict, money wars, the rise of big business, the tariff, immigration. These are all economic issues, and public discourse puts economics at the center of a vigorous national debate over where and how the state should respond to the consequences of the American Industrial Revolution. This is important. The progressives see opportunity in the recurring economic crises of the late 19th century, and they seized it. So who were they? I'm going to ask a few basic questions, and I'll try to answer them. Who were the progressives? Why do I say that they are illiberal? How did they manage to institutionalize their theories of how the economy worked and how society worked? And also, even more importantly, their theory of how to govern an economy. How did then influential ideas about race and heredity inform the progressives' research, their activism, and their policy making? And why, we might get to this one, probably in questions, why do we still care 100 years on? Why do they still matter today? And they do. So who were they? They were white, they were middle class, they grew up mostly in small towns. Most of them were evangelicals. They grew up in homes. They were the sons of missionaries and of ministers. The sons were expected to continue the family calling. The daughters were expected to stay home, and both of them did neither. Instead of saving individual souls, which was the family business, what they did was to set about on an even more ambitious project, which was to save society, that is, to redeem America. They unabashedly described their project as bringing a kingdom of heaven to earth. In the language of the day, they were preaching a social gospel. And it's important to think about them as the sons and daughters of preachers, because preachers not only tell you how to achieve good Christian ends, but also what those ends should be. They saw economic and political reform as a calling. They saw their work as a mission, and that's important to understand how they saw the world and its governance. Here's another thing you need to know about the progressives. They were middle class for the most part, and their protests did not arise out of personal suffering. It arose out of moral and intellectual dissatisfaction with the suffering of others, and also the enrichment of others. Progressives didn't work in factories. They inspected factories. They didn't drink in saloons. They tried to close saloons. They were prohibitionists. The bold women, the social workers who chose to live among the immigrant poor in the city slums, the first social workers, they didn't call themselves neighbors, they called themselves settlers. And even when progressives idealized workers, and many of them did, they tended to patronize these workers. They were romanticizing a brotherhood that they themselves would never consider joining. They had a model for their economics and for their economic reform, an approach to expertise and policymaking. It was a German model. In the 1870s and the 1880s, Americans couldn't go to graduate school in the United States. There was no such thing as graduate training in political economy, so they went to Germany, newly formed. And at the feet of their German professors, they imbibed historicism and statism, but also expertise. And this is going to be crucial for understanding the American variant of progressivism, expertise in the service of an administrative state. Their professors were sexy, they were influential, they were consulted on important matters of national economic policy. And when they were graduate students in Germany, these young progressives they learned a lesson that stuck with them for the rest of their lives, which was economic reform could be a vocation, even a distinguished one. So when they came back to America, their evangelical zeal to redeem the United States was still hot, but it was now tempered by the latest ideas in economics and informed by a working model of how to go about economic reform. This is kind of Bismarckian, top-down social legislation, sort of hostility to free markets and other forms of liberty, and historicism, this idea that there's no economic laws, but economic life varies across time and it varies from place to place. So different times demand different sorts of economics. Now, what's driving them, as I said before, is the Industrial Revolution. Let me just give you a few data points so you can understand how profoundly important the American Industrial Revolution was. Between 1870 and 1913, real GDP quintupled in the United States. Quintupled. Living standards more than doubled in that interval. So the United States goes from being a somewhat backward colonial place, recovering from a brutal civil war, to an economy that's larger than the French Empire, larger than the Italian Empire, larger than the German Empire, larger than the Japanese Empire, and eventually it catches the 19th century colossus, the British Empire, during World War I. It happens really quickly. We have to invent a new word in 1888 to explain another new phenomenon, and that's urbanization, right? The entire American workforce is leaving the farm and going to the factories in the cities, and it's doing pretty fast. It's doing it quickly. In 1880, about half of the labor force was still in agriculture. In 1920, it's down to a quarter. Any economy that grows this rapidly needs labor, and most of that labor, or much of that labor, was met by immigration. So again, in an interval between 1890 and 1914, 15 million immigrants come to a country of 75 million people. About 75% of those 15 million immigrants are Catholics and Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe. By 1910, about 25% of the labor force is foreign-born, and a larger number, closer to 40% of unskilled labor, is foreign-born. If you went to Chicago in 1889, majority immigrant, maybe 60, 70%. And other cities were like that too, San Francisco, New York, Boston. This is also an era, hard to appreciate in retrospect, of serious business cycle volatility. There are huge depressions in the 1870s and in the 1890s. In the 1890s, it was a double dip depression, and you can think about unemployment as being somewhere between 10 and 15% for like 5 years. Pretty serious stuff. Not only that, according to Turner, the frontier has closed, so the safety valve for urban unemployment is no longer available. This is also the era of the rise of organized labor. Organized labor increases as fitfully as the economy does. That is, it's growing very rapidly, but it's up and down. It's the rise of organized capital too. This is the turn of the 20th century. Those 10 years bracketing the turn of the 20th century, you have 1,800 industrial firms horizontally and vertically merged into 150 firms. And about half of those new giants, these new behemoths, and they really are behemoths, they're like 100 to 1,000 times larger than manufacturing concerns before the rise of big business, have market shares of roughly 70% or more. Now, a lot of revolutions are just revolutions because historians later on say that they were revolutions. But this is a case where the intellectuals who lived through the time recognized it as a revolution. Let me just indulge me a couple of quotes. Simon Nelson Patton, who's at the Wharton School, says that there's so much material abundance being produced by the Industrial Revolution that we have a new basis for civilization. Richard T. Ely, who some of you will know, was the founder, the prime mover behind the American Economic Association's founding in 1885, said, "We are living in a new economic world." And as a good graduate of Germany, of a German education, he said, and that's why we need a new economics. Frederick Jackson Turner, who's just announced the closing of the American frontier, told his fellow historians that they were witnessing nothing less than the birth of a new nation. That's how he put it. John Dewey, who many of you will know, said, "One can hardly believe that there has ever been a revolution in all history so rapid, so extensive, and so complete." So, what did the progressives do in response? I tell this tale in 3 acts. In the first act, they turned pro. It's hard to appreciate in retrospect, but if you came to the United States in, say, 1880, right, when half of the workers are still on the land, you would find exactly 3 people teaching political economy more than half time, right? The vocation of economist doesn't exist, and among the political economists, there's like 3. So, in order to become experts serving in the administrative state, the economists have to create some scientific bona fides. And the way they create these bona fides is by establishing economics as an academic discipline. It takes about 20 years between 1880 and 1900. And in so doing, they transform American political economy from a species of kind of public discourse among gentlemen to an expert scientific practice that we now call economics. So they establish their scientific bona fides. If you want to be an expert, you have to be able to tell your client something that they don't understand already. So they not only have to, on the supply side, acquire expertise, they also have to acquire a demand for their expertise. Who's going to hire these tweedy, German-trained, pious social gospelers? It turns out that the great savior, the great employer of economists was going to be the modern administrative state. One of the things to think about is how there are competing intellectual and vocational imperatives in this era. When the economists turn pro, you have to remember laissez-faire is a really lousy strategy for professionalizing, right? How much expertise is required to repeat in every situation? Let the market decide, right? Not too much expertise. So if you're an expert retailing ideas and policy that say politicians or judges can't understand, that's not a good strategy. So that when economists are professionalizing and trying to sell their services as experts to the state, they're making both an epistemic move on the one hand, where they're saying to politicians and to judges and to parties, we know something that you don't. They're also making a vocational move, which is that it's probably going to be good for business. I belabor this slightly because I want you to understand how audacious this move was in retrospect, right? If you're going to establish an administrative government sort of staffed and directed by scientific experts, you have to first transform economics. Second, you have to transform higher education. And third, you have to transform government, because none of these things exist, as I said, in 1880. Now, it's not just the professors. It's also progressives are active, brokering their ideas in investigatory journalism, in reform organizations, in the community, and in public life. These are their activist allies, if you like. And they too are engaged with economic questions, and they too are doing kind of social scientific research designed to produce economic knowledge and designed to influence policymakers. And so it's the progressives, again, I'm making this sort of loud claim that we live in their world, but they're the ones who give us the professor of social science, who give us the scholar activist, who give us the social worker, who give us the muckraking journalist, who give us the economic expert advising or serving in government, who give us the management consultant, who give us the think tanker, who give us the city manager. These are all vocations essentially created from whole cloth by the progressives. Okay, the second act. The second act goes like this. The progressives take their newfound authority as social scientists with expert knowledge, they turn them into rhetorical weapons, and they use that to convince Americans and their political leaders that laissez-faire is not only economically outmoded, it's also ethically wanting. Right? They say that industrial capitalism creates conflict, it creates dislocation, it operates wastefully. This is a hugely important idea, that capitalism is inefficient as well as inhumane, and it distributes its copious fruits unjustly. Not only that, industrial capitalism has given us new organizational entities, things that simply really didn't exist before, like, say, natural monopolies, like, say, industrial corporations, like, say, industrial labor unions, right? So the idea here is that free markets, if they ever could, can no longer self-regulate. What we need if we want progress is the visible hand of a powerful administrative state guided by expert social scientists. If you want economic progress, goes the story, you now need the visible hand of an administrative state guided by experts, and they will diagnose and cure and even treat low wages, long hours, unemployment, labor conflict, industrial accidents, financial crises, unfair trade practices, and all the other elements of industrial capitalism. Now, the third act. In the third act, the economists and their progressive allies join up together in a crusade to reform and remake American government. If you're going to have an administrative state, if that's what's required for economic progress, it's going to have to be built. And I argue that it was built, or at least its foundations were laid, by the end of Woodrow Wilson's first term in March 1917. And countless additions are going to be made to what John R. Commons called the fourth branch. But now you have a government, March 1917, that is taxing personal incomes, that is taxing corporate incomes, that is taxing estates, is practicing antitrust, dissolving corporate industrial combinations in steel, tobacco, oil, and sugar. There's a new Federal Reserve that is regulating money and credit and banking. There's a new Federal Trade Commission that is regulating domestic industry. And there's a new Permanent Tariff Commission that is regulating international trade. State and federal legislation is banning child labor. It's compelling the education of children. It's inspecting factories. It's fixing minimum wages. It's fixing maximum hours. It's paying pensions to single mothers with dependent children. Now, all of this is to say that illiberal reformers insist that in the age of reform, it's not called the age of reform for nothing, that they were diverse and that they were fractious and they had different and sometimes conflicting agendas. This is not anything like a monolithic movement. But what united them most, and the way we should think about them collectively, is an abiding faith in the visible hand of the administrative state as the best means for realizing their decidedly plural ends. There are labor reformers, there are immigration reformers, there are political reformers, there are prohibitionists, there are scientific charity workers. There are many motley and diverse programs, but they all agree that they can get what they want with an administrative state. And in this crucial sense, I argue in Illiberal Reformers that progressivism is not, progressivism is less an ideologically and programmatically coherent agenda of substantive goals. It is better seen as sort of a technocratic theory and ultimately a practice of how to get these goals, how to obtain these ends in the age of industrial capitalism. The heart of progressivism, as Robert Weiba famously summarized it, was its ambition to fulfill its destiny through bureaucratic means. Later on, they would also join the bureaucracies of corporations, but first it was the state. So I would describe the progressives as having a heroic conception of expertise. There's this extravagant faith in science, and you can kind of understand it because this is the moment when science and applied science is doing extraordinary things. This is when Robert Gordon will tell you the 4 or 5 inventions like electricity and like public sanitation and all the rest of it are driving the American economy. So they also have an extravagant faith not just in science and applying it, but also in the state. Remember that the American government, there is no administrative government to speak of. It simply is not yet a thing. And government such as it is, the progressives viewed as profoundly corrupt and profoundly undemocratic. But they imagined, and this again is part of their audacity, that you could in fact change government. You could change government from being corrupt and ward healing and turn it into something far more efficient and rational. You could substitute reason and science for politics. And it's heroic in a second sense too, this idea of expertise. This in as follows. It's not only that, it's not merely technocratic, right? Expert public administrators instruct not only on how to achieve social and economic goals, but also what those goals should be. Remember, this is what preachers do too. And there's a second claim that to justify the adjective of heroic, and that is that the experts possess, as Edward A. Ross called it, a divine spark of science. They are uniquely loyal and incorruptible. So when Edward A. Ross invokes the social engineer, when Richard T. Ely invokes natural aristocrats, they're not just claiming scientific knowledge, they're also claiming scientific virtue. Right? In the progressive's conception, the capitalist is grubbing profit, the politician is pursuing power, But the expert uniquely is selflessly pursuing the good of society, which he also uniquely can be trusted to identify and to serve. I would claim further that the establishment of the fourth branch of government also marks an epoch-making change in the relationship of government to American economic life. It also importantly shifts power within the state. It moves powers from American courts and American parties to the new independent agencies of the executive. Thus, it moves power from judges and from politicians to bureaucratic experts. Remember, these agencies like the Federal Reserve, like the Federal Trade Commission, like the Permanent Tariff Commission, they're chartered to be independent of the White House and of Congress. President can't remove anyone from a commission except for cause. Congress can't remove anyone from a commission. And the reason that Commons called it the fourth branch, the administrative state, is because uniquely they are also endowed with the powers of all three branches of government. Regulatory agencies, their regulations have the full power of federal law, that they have legislative power. They also can enforce their regulations, right? That's the executive power. And when there are disputes about regulations, they also, third, adjudicate those disputes in administrative law courts. That is indeed something new. So it's a little bit misleading in the traditional historiography to say that the progressives brought in the state. They didn't bring in the state. That sort of implies there was no state or that it was absent beforehand. That's not quite right. It is true that they vastly expanded the scope and authority of federal surveillance and regulation of economic life. But it's also the case, I think it's important to recognize, that it relocated regulatory power. It moved it vertically from the states and municipalities upward towards the federal government, and it moved it horizontally away from judges and from legislators to the new experts in the administrative state. Why do I say the progressives were illiberal? First, let me assert, in case it weren't already obvious, that the progressives had some really admirable ideas along with some reprehensible ideas. And the thing to recognize is they advocated both kinds of ideas in the name of progress. In the late 19th century in the United States, a liberal was someone who was committed to individual freedom, a market economy, and strong protection of individual rights against the state. If you want a bumper sticker version, it would be free soil, free labor, and free trade. It was a short interval. Progressives saw this as laissez-faire, which was a pejorative term. They judged it to be unjust, inefficient, and outmoded, and they led a successful crusade to dismantle it. And when they remade American economic life with this new instrument of reform, they also simultaneously remade liberalism. That's why when you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and you look up the term liberal, you'll find one term that says liberal in the 19th century sense, supporting or advocating individual rights, civil liberties, and political and social reform, tending towards individual freedom with little state intervention. And then right above it, liberalism in the 20th century sense, favoring social reform and a lot of state intervention in matters of economic, right? There's two different definitions for the very same word. Now there's a second sense in which, and I guess my title is a double or triple entendre here, progressive reform was illiberal, and it has to do with the word before it became political. Before liberal was appropriated as a description of a set of political views, it referred to somebody who was open-minded, tolerant, free from prejudice or bigotry. And the sensational part of Illiberal Reformers will tell you that the original progressives were not that progressive. Many of them, the intellectual leaders among them, certainly promoted scientific racism. They promoted eugenics. Eugenics is the social control of human heredity. Let me just pause for a minute to tell you a little bit about what eugenics is. Eugenics has sort of Well, it's premised on three things. There are three governing premises of any eugenic program. The first premise is the primacy of heredity. Heredity means that differences in human character, intelligence, temperament are due to differences in heredity. Second, human hierarchy rather than human equality. This means that the survival of the unfit is a problem for the eugenicist. If you're a Darwinian, in contrast, you think that the fittest survive, and so the unfit cannot survive. It's a crucial distinction between the eugenic worldview and the Darwinist worldview. The eugenicist has to ex ante identify groups, races, sexes, nationalities, the disabled who are unfit, because they're starting with the premise that the unfit are deciding, rather than simply asserting after the fact, as a Darwinist would, that the fittest are surviving. And the third premise is that human heredity, like any other sort of social problem, must be regulated rather than left to individual choice. If you're going to be in the business of improving human heredity, you can't just leave it to happenstance. You have to investigate it scientifically. You have to regulate it by regulating marriage, reproduction, immigration, and labor. In other words, eugenics proposes to substitute purposeful social selection for random natural selection. Now, why is it that progressives in particular, and they weren't the only ones, conservatives were drawn to eugenics in some measure, and so were socialists too, but why was it that progressives in particular were attracted to eugenics? I'll give you four reasons that I think matter. The first is that eugenics is deeply anti-individualist, and so too was progressivism. Second, eugenics promised efficiency. Third, it required expertise. After all, you have to identify the fit and the unfit ex ante. And four, it was scientific. Now, the raison d'etre of eugenics, certainly the progressive era version of it, is that racial health is just too important to be left unregulated. The individual's liberty to make her own reproductive, marital, vocational, and locational choices free from state interference end precisely at the point where her choices are seen to endanger the health of the race. So when it came to women, for example, many progressives were not happy about women working, that is, for money, and being employed in the labor force. That was seen to be a threat to the mothers of the race. Sidney Webb put it this way. He was a British socialist. No consistent eugenicist can be a laissez-faire individualist, and yes, unless he throws up the game in despair. He must interfere, interfere, interfere. Eugenics is premised also on efficiency. This is another progressive lodestar. It's almost touching in retrospect how the progressives believed that administrative government could improve just about anything. It could improve firms on factory floors. It could improve the market. It could improve government. It could improve agriculture. It could improve education. It could improve even religion. It could improve human heredity. What eugenicists did in the name of efficiency was to substitute expert-guided state selection based on the idea that natural selection is too slow, it's too inefficient, it's too inhumane, and it's too indifferent to progress. Francis Galton, who is sometimes credited as the modern parent of eugenics, put it this way: when nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly. Expertise also, eugenics also demands expertise, right? If you think that the unfit are surviving, then you're going to need experts to identify the unfit ex ante, right? The experts not only knew better, they could be trusted to pursue the common good of hereditary health. Edward A. Ross, who's a leading sociologist, maybe the most important one of the era, said, "No conscientious person should have the hardihood to ignore eugenics." And it's this combination of anti-individualism, efficiency, expertise, and science. It didn't ensnare everybody, but it did catch many. Those who could resist the temptations of eugenics, were thin on the ground. I don't begin to have time to recap much more of the book, but let me give you one more example of how Darwinian thinking and eugenic thinking intersected in progressive thought during the progressive era. And that is this problem that was named again by Ross, race suicide, so-called race suicide. Race suicide is the idea that immigrants of inferior stock. The first version of the story began with the Chinese, right? The Chinese were the first group to be racially barred from the United States in 1882. And what was the claim? The claim was that coolies, as they were known, disparaged as, could live on a handful of rice, whereas the white man needed red meat. That was how Woodrow Wilson put it, right? And that because the Chinese worker, the coolie so-called, could underlive the white man, the Chinese would take the white man's job, that is to say the Anglo-Saxon American worker, and undercut him thereby. But here's the kicker, here's the fecundity kicker, which is rather than allow his standard of living to be lowered to the Chinese immigrants' level, the American working man would have fewer children and therefore race suicide. That was the story. It was created by Francis Amasa Walker and named by Edward A. Ross. And that story of inferior immigrants undercutting both the wages and employment of the Anglo-Saxon working man was later adapted, much later, to putatively inferior workers, Catholics and Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe, and also to women. This is a story that's not well told. A lot of the ideas surrounding labor legislation for women had to do not so much with protecting women from employment, but rather from protecting employment from women who were seen just like immigrants and just like African Americans and just like the disabled as unjustified usurpers of jobs and wages that properly belonged to white male heads of households. Let me close with a couple of words about what all this might mean for today. This book was finished more than 2 years ago, and at that time Donald Trump was still a figure of fun and not what he has become today. When I wrote this book, I thought it was important for understanding what is an inflection point in American political and economic history, but I never imagined that a year or two later we would be electing the most illiberal candidate in living memory, still less that he would win by re-injecting into our national political discourse repugnant ideas about race and gender and nationality and disability that I thought had been buried. We thought, and we were wrong, that those notions were utterly discredited, but they were not, or at least discredited enough that they would be immediately disqualifying for any serious candidate for high office. And yet they were not. So one way to see illiberal reformers, this is how the New York Times chose to read it, is as a cautionary tale of the perils of intellectual arrogance when you're dealing with explosive social issues. I think that's okay as a capsule summary. The lesson for scholars, and all of you are scholars or future scholars, is that we should proceed when we're doing our work with great intellectual humility. I think, my own view, is that illiberal reformers got the progressives right. I think the portrait is correct. But the progressives themselves thought they had it right too. They actually thought they had it right, and they didn't. And they were the best and the brightest. You have to remember that people like Woodrow Wilson and Richard T. Ely and John R. Commons and Edward A. Ross are the most prominent public intellectuals of their day. We still have buildings and institutes, I sit in one, and prizes named for these men. And they were mostly all men. Still today, right? They were racist, they were eugenicist, they were sexist, they were elitist, and they used and abused their political and intellectual authority to promote these ideas. They also thought that they were right about so-called inferior races. That's an important tale. In the last part of the book, it's sort of a conclusion of sorts. One of the things I note, this is a hard book to write, and all the research was hard to do, is that the history of bad ideas is just as important as the history of good ideas. And they're sometimes hard to look at. I'll be the first to admit that. Why is that true? Why is the history of bad ideas just as important as the history of good ideas? The reason is that any idea, even though we regard it as a bad idea today, that's historically important, was almost by definition thought to be a good idea by many people at the time. They are not good ideas, and yet the best and the brightest people who we still honor with building and prize names and all the rest of it thought they were. Now we can say in retrospect that, by golly, they're wrong and we won't make those same mistakes. I suggest we will. 100 years from now, we'll be making similar sorts of mistakes. I hope not so egregious. So be humble in your work. Another factor of our times today is connected to this hostility towards expertise and towards so-called technocratic elites. There is a profound dissatisfaction in parts of this country, at least, with political elites, with cultural elites, and with intellectual elites. That's us. We are accused of economic prescriptions that have led to economic inequality and maybe even worse, slow growth and stagnation. So this is another topic that has proved to be a hardy perennial, which is to say, beware of technocratic hubris. When the progressives designed the administrative state, when they blueprinted the state that they themselves and their students would eventually staff and which would eventually grow into an enormous sort of central part of the, our political landscape today, they really were basing their choices on a wholly new thing. It was an incredibly ambitious project. And I think that at the time, they didn't think through, they were so busy retailing it, they didn't think carefully through the unintended consequences. So we might want to avoid, in the name of humility, we also might want to avoid, let's call it technocratic hubris. Democracies are democracies and they need to be democratic, but they also need to work. And there is a deep and continuing tension between small d democracy and technocracy. And we need to also be humble, again, about what we know. And the last thing I'd say that still matters, besides technocratic humility, if it weren't already incredibly obvious, is that race still matters, and it matters profoundly, and it intersects in complicated ways with class. One of the peculiarities of American history in particular is that if you think about it for just a second, of course race matters in this country. There's been no period where race hasn't mattered. But the one area, the one corner of Gilded Age and Progressive Era historiography where traditionally race has been neglected is in the history of economics and in the history of public policy, for the most part, because we've used class as a lens to see economic life and assumed that race was not so important. But I think that that was an omission I hope to have helped remedy, is that race matters in the history of economics and in the history of policy. Class matters too, but race matters profoundly. We are, I would argue, still debating, more than 100 years on, what it means to be an American in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, polyglot society. And there is this deep tension still between what you might call civic identity and racial identity. Civic identity are those ringing phrases in the founding documents, right? All men are created equal. Racial identity is what it sounds like. A nation, after all, requires a people. So I wouldn't call it a pleasure, but one of the profound surprises is that a book about a group of relatively obscure politicians and scholars and activists of over 100 years ago has proven to be shockingly relevant to today as well. And I hope if you haven't read it, you get a chance to read it. Thank you for having me.